Welcome to Writer's Block, K-State student-run podcast where Touchstone staff have on-the-square discussions on all things literature. My name is Ian Lutz. I am the editor-in-chief of Touchstone, and today we have a very special guest, Taylor Brorby, author of Coming Alive, Action and Civil Disobedience, and co-editor of Fracture, Essays, Poems, and Stories on Fracking in America, joins us to talk about his new memoir, Boys and Oil, Growing Up Gay in a Fractured Land. Mr. Brorby, thank you so much for coming.
It's great to be here.
So I want to first start off by saying your memoir, beautifully written.
Oh, thank you.
The opening sections where you talk about the prairie land in such this poetic prose, having been born and raised here in Manhattan, Kansas, kind of reignited a love of the prairie lands.
Good, excellent.
So I kind of want to go to the Overlook and review the land myself. Yet, after you set up the prairie as this, character upon itself, your prose about your own life is just wonderfully approachable. You're still highly intellectual, but it's very, very down to earth and endearing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And I gotta say, the reoccurring motifs you have, nothing's mentioned by accident. I oftentimes had to slow down reading because I recognize something from 100 pages back has come back up beautifully.
Well, thank you. You're a good reader.
I'm a slow reader, for sure. And actually, on the topic of your writing in the prairie, your journey and maturity, your sense of identity is closely tied to your understanding of the Midwestern prairie lands. Your book's whole structure is broken down into parts from soil to roots, shoots and sprouts, and the eventual, am I saying this correctly, flore?
That's right.
The blossoming of your life by the end. But you also detail that growing up, especially in center North Dakota, that you needed to escape that land to grow, not just as a gay person, but as an intellectual. Yet when you were away, you only yearned to come back home. Could you elaborate on this kind of paradoxical relationship between yourself, the prairie, and outsiders in your life?
Well, I think for me that's a pretty common sensibility of certain people in rural America, that if you have the benefit like I do of growing up in a massive landscape, it can invoke humility and awe and wonder, and you notice things beyond the human-made world. But since we're humans, you might also crave things humans crave. I grew up in a small town that doesn't have theater or an orchestra, these things that I really love. Or when I wanted to be a Disney animator, there are no Disney animators, if you've not heard, in center North Dakota. So there were these ways where my upbringing gave me a certain gift of perspective of the natural landscape, but also was limiting in terms of the opportunities for the intellectual life, and also even just maybe the professions I wanted to pursue, that I knew the world was big beyond the natural world, beyond the landscape where I lived, and I wanted to see what that bigger human-made world looked like as well.
Absolutely, and you're certainly not alone in that. I'm sure many Kansans, North Dakotans, Wyomans have felt that way. I know myself, having grown up and lived all my life, I actually went and lived and worked in Japan for 6 years. And just had the exact same situations of awe of someplace else, learning things I've never learned before, and then needing to come home, only to want to go back.
Right. There's this tug and pull and push and all of that, I think, in us at all times.
And you really nailed it with having it be a very human tension, where we are always going to be tied to where we're from, but always wanting to see what is outside the lawn. So it's fantastic. And then continuing on with this idea of the prairie, you are extremely knowledgeable, not just on the flora, but also the fauna, the animals of the region. You have this kinship with so many of these prairie animals. You kind of connect to them throughout this book. Your very first secret steps in your mother's heels, you describe yourself like a newborn egret taking your first steps. And when you caught a pallid sturgeon, an endangered species in the region, you learned the loneliness of being predated upon. You even quoted saying, "To live on the prairie is to be hunted, whether by a coyote, a pack of boys, or by the sting of loneliness." I love that line. But as climate change and human encroachment push various species to extinction, what do we risk losing beyond biodiversity? If we lose something of ourselves, what parts do we lose?
Well, beyond just biodiversity, I have to link that to that then the prairie becomes a lot quieter. If you lose the sage grouse, or you lose different type of birds like godwits from hydraulic fracking, for instance, the symphony of the prairie actually gets a lot quieter, which impacts us not only because of the loss of other species, but selfishly just the natural music we get to hear in the places we call home. But there's a part where, for us, the loss of those species implicates us in a wider unraveling of the bioregion where you and I are currently speaking. You know, if we lose certain predators like coyotes, certain other animals get to flourish that then harm the bioregion by having a surplus in population. But there's also a way that by losing these animals for us in our human-made systems, they're a helpful reminder to us of balance. I mean, I think we're seeing us living out of sorts on the planet right now with throwing different weather patterns and systems into climate chaos, or here in Kansas, the erosion of topsoil from one type of what we now call conventional farming.
Yes.
You know, that practices one type of crop being grown and not mimicking diversity like the prairie in particular teaches us. But it's maybe even into that realm of, man, do I dare say it, like religion. There's a spiritual loneliness of that having a human-centered world kind of is like having too much candy. You get sugar sickness. That then we become so self-centered that we forget that there are other ways of existing on the planet, or that we're one of many species. And in fact, humanity right now seems to be getting lonelier and lonelier. And I think we feel that by our obsession with technology, trying to be connected with people, and yet somehow simultaneously disconnected through our Instagram posts and public performance of self.
I think that is very, very eloquently put. This idea that our own interactions are kind of saccharine to a point of poisoning. And that's a fantastic point. I can say that I only saw our state's bird, the meadowlark, at the age of 29, just a couple years back, and got to actually hear its call. All my life, never heard it. It's a threatened bird, and it's probably going to get more and more difficult to hear. So the symphony of that prairie being lost is certainly not lost on others, and you articulate it wonderfully.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, on this idea of this environmental nature, you're obviously no stranger to environmental activism. You were on the front lines of the oil pipeline protests back in 2016, and you've written about this several times. And I'm also quite curious, in your book, you rather introspectively note that fossil fuels flow through your veins as a product of a coal town. They filled your parents' bank account, they fed you, and they got you the instruments that you played in high school. One of your first treasures as a child was this shiny piece of lignite coal. Yet you describe the pain of repressing your identity as a coal that you swallow and burn inside your chest. A lot of conflicting feelings on this fossil fuel. Can you explain this complicated relationship you have with fossil fuels as both opponent and beneficiary, repressor and repressed?
Well, I wouldn't have said it at the time growing up because I didn't know any better, but I certainly grew up in a company town. The 3 counties, that one of which I grew up in, and the 2 surrounding us, Oliver, Mercer, and McLean counties, are filled with mining towns. These tiny towns whose whole existence centers around a coal mine and a power plant. So all of the teachers' spouses work at the coal mine, or the people that work at a gas station, their husbands work at the coal mine. Softball league is sponsored by the coal mine, things like this. And so these communities is sort of what we were saying about the prairie and the elimination of species. They're monocultures. There's one way of earning your existence. Without the coal mine, there are no school children to teach in these towns. So reliance upon one industry becomes everybody's way of organizing their politics and their principles of blind allegiance to a company's bottom dollar. I mean, I grew up swimming in a lake in North Dakota that never freezes, and all lakes in North Dakota are supposed to freeze. I mean, the water was used to cool the coal-fired turbine engines of the power plant where my mother worked. And that's insulting on a natural level because lakes should freeze. And so it means I grew up in a gaslit community. And part of it, when people will, say, well, your upbringing was paid for, as I've written about and acknowledge, I have to believe that people would find a different way of earning a living. I mean, to rely still on an industry that is helping aid fossil fuel extraction writ large and climate change globally is insufferable to me. I mean, it's sort of ensuring that we continue to tighten the noose around our neck and other species' necks as well. And so, yes, one should acknowledge that this is how my family earned its income. But humans can adapt and have lived differently and should live differently. And part of it is that natural landscape that I've articulated loving was also compromised because of this massive drag line destroying it. So you're growing up in a landscape that you love, and everyone you're surrounded by is making their money by unmaking that landscape. That's a real psychic trauma for a child to be dealing with.
Yeah, and earlier you had mentioned how the elimination of one species that helps regulate another ends up helping to destroy the landscape. When you don't have those other ideologies, those other power sources, you develop that monoculture that is at risk of being wiped out itself, as well as wiping everything else around, especially within news of the last 15 years of coal being phased out in many places. Right. And the outrage that's come from that. You really articulate that vulnerability that people aren't aware of. So it's a blind tying of the noose, as you mentioned. And yeah, I think we're going to be seeing that more and more as time goes on.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, shifting just a little bit, one of the things I saw in your book on a more personal level, you regularly examine the importance of body for one's identity. Growing up in Center, this very insular rural town, you say that your body betrayed you, as you thought that you had the wrong kind of body for wrestling and your sexuality. And then when you went off to college, you reinvented yourself. You said that you were an accomplished wrestler, and you used that wrestling prowess, that natural wrestling prowess, as a means to get that secret pleasure of physical contact with friends, something you thought you couldn't do back home. But you also, even after college, describe your coping mechanisms of weightlifting at the gym and gay club dancing in Minneapolis as attempts to live in your body rather than your mind during these incredibly tumultuous times in your life. How important is the balance between self-image and projected image for you? And how might those growing up in similar conditions avoid misusing or mistrusting their bodies?
I think the hard thing about this is how do we trust the communities, or can we trust the communities from which we come? How is, especially in my way of thinking, masculinity performed or not performed? I grew up with very tender grandpas who loved giving hugs. This is not the father that raised me, though. My father was a sort of type of Hulk Hogan personality and very gruff and Harley Davidson driving. And you can be tough in Harley Davidson driving and still a feminist, I think. But this is not the father I was raised by. So there are these ways that when you're younger, you look for signals of what it means to be a boy or to grow into a man, or men don't give hugs, or they shove each other rather than, interlink their arms. Like young girls have different standards, of course, of what they grow up and how they establish hierarchy than boys. But for instance, we know no 8th grade boy on the prairie is having a slumber party with like 4 other guy friends and all sleeping in the same bed, like how girls do. That just simply doesn't happen. Right. The rumors would spread quite quickly. There's a wider spectrum of sexuality given to girls who grow into women than there are to men. So the narrative I created around being an amateur wrestler was also, as you suggest and know, an attempt to just be physically close to other boys and men, not in a sexual way, but in the way that boys really suffer from a culture of loneliness, in the sense of, we know giving hugs actually helps lower blood pressure. Science proves this. The longer the hug, the better you feel. And how isolated men in this culture feel from each other and from people writ large. If people are unfortunately born straight and they're a man, when they break up with their girlfriend, their social network tends to go away because they rely on their girlfriend or their partner for everything. And so there are echoes of that, I think, in my book, of having to project an identity. I would never say for anyone else, be true despite what comes if you're living in sort of a compromised situation, or one you suss out as dangerous. Like I had to be the fastest in my class, or do the most pull-ups, or be great at King of the Hill because toughness was valued in the town I grew up in. I would have preferred it to be otherwise, but you have to be able to read the landscape of where you live. But I think it gets to an interesting point of how do you create interior spaces that allow you to thrive, or at least survive, to go on. Whether that's eventually looking at moving away, or saying, well, this is my public persona versus my private. Now, that's a hard psychic disconnect to rectify. I think we all would love to be integrated humans, but there we have it.
Yeah. And you sort of had to find a niche to survive in all these landscapes, which must not be hard for your psyche. As you said, you kind of lose who you are in each of these places. Yeah. And I think you touch upon that quite well in your novel. And kind of on this topic of who you are and what you like, in your memoir, you are quite the Renaissance man, I must say. I'm
just a nerd, Ian. I'm just a nerd.
And honestly, nerds are fantastic. We need more nerds in this world.
Agreed.
Your interests just span virtually the entire spectrum. You spent your childhood doing lots of sketches of the different animals and plants around you, even some cartoons I've seen, which then developed into your appreciation of paintings later on in life. You practiced saxophone quite vigorously, even being driven to the nearby city of Bismarck to continue your lessons. And that developed into an appreciation of fine opera in college. You even started university first as a history major, then switched to music major, switched again to English. Then you attended seminaries before kind of establishing your writing career. How has your interdisciplinary approach to life contributed to your work as a writer?
Well, I think they all revolve around stories. I mean, whatever the various discipline, the story of human religion is fascinating because several billion people believe in something on the planet. or understanding if out of that belief system people create their systems of ethics and morals. That's an interesting story. Why is it that we have culture where women can only show their eyes? Why do we have human cultures where we go to church every Sunday? Why do we have systems that come out of the celebration of nature? Those are all fascinating stories, and history has proven them to be political and complicated. People get burned at the stake over their ideas or not falling in line with certain ideas. Art is one of the most incredible things that we have created or sought to express ourselves on the planet. The idea that certain pitches, when sounded together, can scare us, can make us weep, can remind us of a feeling we haven't explored over decades, or certain shades of pigment do the same thing for us, that we can look at some classical painting like a Turner sunset in London, or as it was said, no one knew there was fog in London until Turner painted it, because everyone just thought fog was there and never noticed it, but then by putting it down on a canvas, people, oh, that's right, we live with this thing called fog all the time.
I've never known that.
Yeah, so art can help remind us of where we live. If we noticed it at all, or if we had forgotten it, it can help recenter us on our place and the place we call home. It can take us to faraway places like literature does. It can take us to outer space. It can create things like zombies for us to encounter, or it can explore prairie grasses. And so for me, it's all related to the human need to express some way through storytelling who we've been, who we are, and who we might become. And those all come out of those various interests of mine, but they seem, for my buck, to be related to our impulse for storytelling. But I'm just sort of hungry for all those different disciplines, because they're complicated and important, I think, to know.
I have to agree completely. I think most college students who are getting the most out of their education have this period of their life where they start to see everything as connected.
That's right.
And for some, that gets kind of lost as time goes on. Many are told as they start to switch majors by family or well-meaning professors that a jack of all trades, a master of none.
Right.
What do you think about that? Should students be told that kind of adage or that ideology to just buckle down and stick to one?
Yeah, well, I get worried about our culture's obsession with specializing, or when I'm encountering 18-year-old students of mine who say, I'm so nervous, I don't know what I want to be, and I go, that's perfect. My worry over libraries, your library right next door is one of many like this. We're sending the books away. Libraries, the reason books are important, especially in libraries, is under the Dewey Decimal System. You can go there looking for a book you know exists, but then it's nestled amongst all these related books that you had no clue existed. And how can you look for something you don't know that it exists? You have to have shelves of that. You can't go into a digital archive and look for something you have no clue of,
Exactly.
But that by maybe doing a psychology paper, you're finding that it's nestled related to the psychology of art, and you might have no clue that that's even a possibility to understand. Or you might be studying philosophy and then encounter a book in that section that's on the philosophy of science, and you've never thought philosophy and a hard science could be related. And so for me, and it's maybe why, because I'm just too old, fat, and tired to do anything else, I just specialize in sentences, is that everything's interesting. We should be learning all the time and reading all the time. And my worry about the specialties is, we have seen this historically speaking, is that systems can change and then your job can be eliminated. So if you don't have a brain that can think beyond the particular tasks you've been trained for, if you don't have a liberal arts way of thinking through examples and critical analysis, you're also not adaptable. I mean, it gets back to the earlier question you asked me about extinction. The prairie models diversity. it should happen in our thinking too. We should have a varied diet of what we ingest through our intellect as well as in our body and in our landscapes.
Honestly, I wish you could be part of the classes that we teach here at K-State. Inevitably, we have students that always ask, why am I learning this? Why am I doing this? And explain to them that not everything has to be tied to getting money after college. It can be, you do this for enjoyment. You do this to learn. Learning is actually part of human health. And I think we've all been in that situation where we go to a Dewey Decimal style library and we stay there for an hour or two longer than we wanted because we find an interesting book, have to sit there, read what it's about. And that's kind of the magic of libraries, this diverse landscape that you mentioned. And like on that topic of the diverse libraries, we're seeing as you know, in recent years, there are lots of these book challenges. They're sending away books, as you mentioned. And around the nation, they tend to target books which discuss sex, BIPOC issues, or contain basic LGBTQ representation. A lot of these challenges link that content they want to censor as politically motivated in nature, usually saying that it shouldn't belong in children's literature, children being a very broad range of ages. And they say that politics is unhealthy for the development of children K through 12. What are your thoughts on that as a writer, an activist, and someone who went through the K through 12 system as a gay student?
Well, I never read a book that I knew about through my K through 12 education that was written by a queer person. I certainly had a good education in terms of, we read Toni Morrison, for instance. We read some James Baldwin. We read classical texts. But the idea that we should read anything that was set in North Dakota never happened. And one of the country's best writers, Louise Erdrich, a Pulitzer Prize winner, is from North Dakota. All of her novels and stories are set in North Dakota. What a gift that would have been to read not only an Indigenous writer, but one of the country's best writers, and read stories that were set in landscapes I knew. It might have planted a seed that being a writer is or could be possible. And with these challenges, part of it is we all exist, children most especially, in systems of politics. Children can be raised by foster parents. That's a political system. They can be raised by single mothers. That's a political system. What is a quote-unquote traditional family? Inherently having a father and a mother doesn't mean you're going to have a great upbringing. You can read a lot of books by writers who have had that type of upbringing, and a very rough one at that. So what do we mean when we say children are too young for politics? They know they're in systems. They might not have the language around what we think of Democrat, Republican, Independent. This is not what I mean. They know that certain friends of theirs, maybe themselves, get a certain type of meal accommodation at school because their family might be poorer than theirs. So children are aware and they know they're in these systems, and they should have stories that reflect that reality, because children have huge emotions that they feel around these things, and stories and books and art are sort of like life preservers in a rough sea when they're just trying to learn their times tables while navigating these other things. And no time in history have we seen where books and art and censorship is the flavor of the day. Does it turn out well? This is normally the early stages of when certain groups start to be rounded up and eliminated. Certain stories take precedent over others, and manipulation becomes the task of the government and certain political interests. So we should be very afraid if we're entering a time where just in the past few years, book banning has more than doubled, or the attempts at book banning have more than doubled.
Exactly. And it's kind of akin to like the great dying that we've seen in geological records of this this death of a lot of potentially great literature to spawn other great literature, because of a monoculture of ideologies. A lot of these sensorial powers, they tend to be parent groups that are rallying behind parents' rights to their children's education. And I think you mentioned quite well that it's a belief that their children are in a sanctuary that is defended against all these outside perspectives and entities. When children, they are open-eyed. They are very aware of the world around them.
Yeah.
How many times have a parent had a child ask, "What does this word mean?" They go, "Where'd you learn that?"
Yeah,
oh
right.
goodness. Where books can explain that in articulate ways that allow them to learn. And that actually, all of these questions just dovetail wonderfully together, I must say. In your particular situation, you talked about your estrangement from your parents. You were outed to them by another family member way before you were ever prepared to do that. And you had these intense moments of shock, despair, indignation, depression, all of these things that are quite natural in such a situation. And at this time, you kind of, I think in one part, in one particular interview, you said that you went to the library to read yourself out of despair.
Mm-hmm.
And as a fairly voracious reader, what kind of books did you find comfort in? And how important is that for those in similar situations?
I sort of devour books. I mean, my 20s were spent eating books, 3 or 4 of them a week or so, just trying to create some sort of stable ground for me in which to exist, because this happened when I was 22. So I sort of spent a whole decade searching for stories that could provide me shelter or stability in certain ways. And it could be anything, of course, but early in that time, I'd really turned to a lot of memoirs. And there's a sort of clarifying moment that happens for someone when you read a number of books that maybe aren't exactly your situation, but you realize that the difficulty you're going through isn't unique in a helpful way. It's not to sort of say, "Oh, Taylor, build a bridge and get over it." But it's to say, this person faced a huge hurdle, maybe even bigger than the one I'm in. And they wrote their story. Like at some point they had enough stability where they articulated this story so I could receive it and learn from it. So it has to suggest not maybe that life gets quote unquote better, whatever that means, but that a person reached a certain plane of existence where they could handle the situation they're in, and then maybe reflect on what had happened earlier and then articulate it for someone else. And so it allowed me to feel like I slowly was on less shaky ground. So early in that, it became a lot of memoir, not a lot of queer memoirs. It was more memoirs from women who grew up in abusive situations. I read a lot around abuse in that time because that's really how I would frame it in my mind, of feeling disowned over this one part of my identity was from my parents' inability to understand that and sort of weaponize it. But poetry was always something I would come back to. Even, I'm just so old-fashioned, even back to like the Psalms, they're so juicy and weird, it's like, oh, me and my hour of need and darkness and despair. You're like, wow, this is really over the top, King David. And then you could read, funny poems by Shel Silverstein or environmental poems by Wendell Berry. And so poetry for me really took shape around this time too, because poems are kind of like picked up little polished pebbles you can put in your pocket and carry around with you. If you sit down and spend some time with a poem and you commit it to memory, you're a lot less lonely than you were before. And so that became kind of a tactic to try to read widely in poetry, like Audre Lorde or Adrienne Rich or Mary Oliver or someone, just to be able to give myself a little digestible thing that maybe I wouldn't be able to read hundreds of pages in a novel, but a poem you can sort of look and say, I can tackle that page. And you're sort of transformed by the time you're done with the poem. So it helped me have like an emotional response in a brief period that allowed me to handle the predicament I found myself in.
I honestly, your one phrase of poems being little pebbles that you polish and carry in your pocket, it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Say.
I just created now for you, Ian. I've never said it before.
And it is eternalized now in the digital format. And I think I wish more people would see it that way, because there are many that still see poetry as something to increase your social clout.
Sure.
I know this poem, I know this,
Yeah.
but actually use it as therapeutic and as comfort in times of need. Getting back to that lyrical state, that it is an art form that you speak and you say to yourself. You understand all too well. It's almost like you write poetry or something.
Yeah, I know. I have been known to write a poem on occasion. Yes.
And I guess my final question here is, you wrote a memoir about your experiences, and it covers these very intense moments, intense thoughts of your life with reflection. But your life is not over yet.
That's right.
Is there going to be another memoir in your future?
I just finished my next one this morning in Dr. Dodd's basement. So I've been cramming to try to work on this other one. I have a novel that should come out before it. I'm moving into fiction because there's a huge bookshelf of North Dakota that needs filling with literature, and I need to be able to invent it, because life writing, by which I mean nonfiction, memoir, right, is very hard, I find. Fiction is pure invention. I don't understand when people who are novelists say I have writer's block. All you have to do is, Ian walked into the room. Well, who's Ian? What does he look like? What's his backstory? Just keep the story moving. You can take Ian out later. But memoir, you have to get right, because it involves real people. Even when you change there's about 150 names in that book you've read that are changed. Some genders are changed because people have a right to their privacy. You can also be sued over nonfiction writing. So there are details we allow it to be changed, for instance, in memoir, like, does it really matter that your shirt is more Merlot colored than if it were green? We have to assign a color to it because it helps the reader see an image in their mind. But if you're describing an intense situation that involves others, and it seems that you're making things up, you can face legal repercussions over that. It's very serious. This is why writing memoir is important, because it is truth set down. So this memoir, I think I have the market cornered on this. To my knowledge, there is no other memoir about being a type 1 diabetic who's gay during the time of climate change. So it's a more layered memoir in certain ways, maybe, though I don't want to disparage my own book, Boys in Oil. But if I were to say to you, Ian, write an essay about how climate change, type 1 diabetes, and being gay relate, you might find that a tough nut to crack. They're related because they're all true in me. And so there are layers out of which I can pull my life and set them into sharp relief. And so, readers of this future book should be able to go to a diabetic camp, or no one's, to my knowledge, written a scene about gay diabetic sex, for instance. So, these funny sort of things, and while also thinking about, on a warmer or wilder planet, the chronically ill are sort of first line responders in how our bodies handle extreme heat or extreme drought. And so I think there are metaphors out of which to pull my chronic illness to help us understand better what the body of the planet is going through currently. So that's just wrapped up this morning. I need to type it up, and so in a few years we might be talking about that book. I'm actually kind of I'm speechless, going, oh wow, I just met you downstairs roughly 40 minutes ago, and
you had just finished up a book.
Yeah, that's why I'm exhausted.
Well, you certainly don't seem that way. You were bright and chip and cheery, and I must say you have been an absolute pleasure to have here. And I wish you the best. I look forward to seeing what this new book is, what it'll be titled, and I will probably be, a customer very soon in the future.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you so much.